Hello, this video will provide an introduction to Women, Peace and Security, also known as the acronym WPS. This is part one of a two-part video on WPS covering the concepts and the importance of integrating WPS into military operations as it applies to the Land Component Force. First, we will go over the outline that we are going to follow throughout this video that will expand upon the basic knowledge of what WPS is, and then discuss the field of WPS, walking from the international to the national policy frameworks. You will note here, when we talk about what WPS is, we'll include the WPS agenda, which includes United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and the subsequent family of resolutions. When we transition to the national level here, you will see that we will talk about the U.S. National Action Plan on WPS and the Department of Defense Implementation Guide, and end with discussing the WPS Act. As we do this, we will transition from the strategic to the operational level of integrating WPS into military operations. We will include a general overview of the specified actions and outcomes given to the Department of Defense related to the implementation of WPS, and briefly discuss how this operational application is addressed further in part 2 of this two-part video series. We will end with a summary of what we covered in part 1. So what is WPS? Women, Peace and Security is a concept that refers to a legal and political framework originating from the landmark 2000 United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and following subsequent related resolutions, including those of 2016. These resolutions together are referred to as the WPS Agenda and go far beyond being just about women. In general, WPS highlights 50% of the population around the world who historically have been and currently may be overlooked as key actors on the ground in which engagement is beneficial across many domains. However, in broader terms, WPS critically looks at how each gender experiences conflict differently and how these relationships converge. In this aspect, WPS can have a positive impact for the whole society. As a land component force, integrating a gender perspective during training, planning, and throughout mission execution and recovery activities may, for example, aid in identifying the importance of consolidated gains within a population to support security and stabilization in an area of operation. Identifying these gains in advance within the security environment can provide insight into shaping operations to establish desired effects throughout the mission. As we advance the application of WPS concepts within our force, we want to think about how to apply this gender perspective. This includes looking at how WPS can be integrated across all types of military operations and activities. Ultimately, it acknowledges how the inclusion of a gender-based perspective can benefit the mission by improving the peace and security of lives within the human security domain in which it operates in and/or influences. Now that we established what WPS is and provided an insight into how we can apply WPS in the land component force, let's continue our discussion by laying out how we moved from international to national policies on WPS. UNSCR 1325 states that women and children account for the vast majority of those adversely affected by armed conflict, including refugees and internally displaced persons, and increasingly are targeted by combatants. Seeing as conflict and war impact women and girls differently, this initial UN document recognized the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts and in peacebuilding. UNSCR 1325 affirmed that effective institutional arrangements to guarantee their protection and full participation in the peace process can significantly contribute to the maintenance and promotion of international peace and security, meaning more sustainable peace arrangements with the involvement of women. UNSCR 1325 specifically acknowledged the need for international humanitarian and human rights laws that protect the rights of women and girls during and after conflict. Additional narratives and resolutions address the special impact on girls, boys, and men, thus acknowledging all other genders. But bottom line, the UNSCR 1325 was the first resolution to focus on the meaningful participation of women in maintaining peace and security. The WPS agenda addressed 4 discrete pillars, and the U.S. adopted these 4 pillars as objectives while adding a 5th in its national version of WPS called the U.S. National Action Plan on WPS. This National Action Plan, or NAP, on WPS was first issued in 2011 and then revised in 2016. We will be discussing how the U.S. aligned each of its objectives to the 4 pillars. But first, let's go through a brief history of relevant conferences and resolutions leading up to and following UNSCR 1325 that aligned with the WPS agenda to inform the U.S. NAP on WPS and ultimately the WPS Act of 2017. We'll then move into historical background on how the NAP on WPS came about and go over some narratives of the specified actions and outcomes to the Department of Defense in the 2016 National Action Plan on WPS, ultimately finishing with the WPS Act. For clarity purposes, we will be using the phrase WPS Agenda in this video when referring to United Nations level documents. We'll use the term WPS when referring to the U.S. or national level documents. So here's the history of WPS. Prior to the adoption of UNSCR 1325, several major global conferences and policy frameworks sought to advance the rights of women and girls. Beginning in 1975, the UN convened world conferences to elevate gender equality on the global stage. In 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women yielded the Beijing Declaration and Platform, with critical areas of concern promoting the role of women in peacemaking. Since then, the UN's 8 Millennial Development Goals and the revised subsequent Sustainable Development Goals, set in 2000 and 2015 respectively, have held equality and empowerment as central to its achievement. Evidence that gender equality is essential to building peace and security has also grown substantially. Research shows, for example, that countries with high levels of gender-based discrimination are more likely to experience intra- and interstate conflict, while countries in which men and women have more fair and equal access to opportunities tend to be stable and peaceful. Specific areas of concern within the Beijing Conference included women and armed conflict, and areas within the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, also focused on the protection of women. It has been proven that maintaining a focus on the protection and empowerment of women aids the success of SDGs, specifically that by advancing SDG number 5 on gender equality alone, one may advance all other goals simultaneously. In 2000, the UN SCR 1325 became a landmark document acknowledging the changing nature of war and recognizing that civilians are increasingly targeted and women in particular continue to be excluded from participation in peace processes. The resolution reaffirms the important role of women in the prevention and resolutions of conflicts, peace negotiations, peace building, peacekeeping, humanitarian response, and in post-conflict reconstruction, and stressed the importance of their equal participation and full involvement in all efforts for the maintenance and promotion of peace and security. Resolution 1325 urged all actors to increase the participation of women and incorporate gender perspectives in all UN peace and security efforts. It also calls on parties in conflict to take special measures in protecting women and girls from gender-based violence, particularly rape and other forms of sexual abuse, in situations of armed conflict. The resolution provided a number of important operational mandates with implications for member states and the entities of the UN system. UNSCR 1325 offers 18 key points, 3 of which include the need for a gender advisor role in the military. These covered adopting a gender perspective at the operational level, specifically by incorporating more women in peace operations, the requirement for training and education of staff and force elements, and the education and understanding of the laws and protection requirements. Subsequent resolutions following the UNSCR 1325 covered everything from children in armed conflict to sexual exploitation and human trafficking within peace operations. These follow-on resolutions expanded WPS themes and covered protection of civilians, children in armed conflict, countering violent extremism, and sexual exploitation and abuse. In addition to these resolutions being far-reaching, they are also just importantly included men and boys as integral to any process or changes. For example, within foreign assistance, significant actions included supporting ethical data collection on the prevalence of gender-based violence, which includes men and boys in order to better inform programming. Simply put, all genders are valuable in security operations. What follows is a breakdown of key narratives within all the most relevant resolutions, starting with supporting resolutions that led into what is considered the WPS agenda. In 2001, UNSCR 1366 was established on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, followed by UNSCR 1408 in 2002, which looked at civil society initiatives. UNSCR 1612 of 2005 focused on children in armed conflict and established a UN Security Council working group to make recommendations on methods to protect children affected by armed conflict. And UNSCR 1674 of 2006 was centered on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. The next several resolutions are all considered part of the WPS agenda, beginning in 2008 with UNSCR 1820, which discussed sexual violence as a war crime. The resolution addressed sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict situations and requested a report from the Secretary General by the following year with information on the systemic use of sexual violence in conflict areas, and proposals for strategies to minimize the prevalence of such acts with benchmarks for measuring progress. Then, UNSCR 1888 in 2009 further strengthened efforts to end sexual violence against women and children in armed conflict. In the same year, UNSCR 1889 addressed women in the peace process, urging member states, UN bodies, donors, and civil society to ensure that women's protection and empowerment is taken into account both during post-conflict needs assessment and planning. The following year, UNSCR 1960 covered violence against men, women, and children, establishing a monitoring, analysis, and reporting mechanism on conflict-related sexual violence. It also called upon parties to armed conflict to make specific, time-bound commitments to prohibit and punish sexual violence and asked the Secretary General to monitor these commitments. This resolution was the first to emphasize that men are victims too and was actually proposed by the United States. In 2013, the UNSCR 2106 looked at sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict, focusing on accountability for perpetrators of sexual violence in conflict and stressed women's political and economic empowerment. The same year, UNSCR 2122 followed and involved women's role in conflict prevention and resolution. It addressed the persistent gaps in the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda based on the highlights in the Secretary General's report on the matter. In 2015, UNSCR 2242 acknowledged women peacekeepers, addressing women's role in countering violent extremism and terrorism. It also took into account gender recommendations from the high-level independent panel on peace operations. More recent resolutions that also apply to the WPS concept internationally came out in 2016. These included UNSCR 2272 as the first resolution aimed at preventing sexual exploitation and abuse by those under a UN mandate. Also, Resolution 2272 held UN peacekeepers accountable and offered the first disciplinary mechanism for addressing sexual misconduct. UNSCR 2331 emphasized the ways in which human trafficking contributes to other forms of transnational organized crime, which could further exacerbate conflict and foster insecurity and instability. Following the codification of the UNSCR 1325 in 2000, member states were called to incorporate a gender perspective to address the disproportionate and unique effect of armed conflict on women. The U.S. directly responded by publishing its first WPS National Action Plan, or NAP, in 2011 and updated that plan in 2016. The U.S. aligned specific objectives with the 4 pillars under the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, covering protection, prevention, participation, and access to relief recovery. The U.S. added a 5th objective called institutionalization, which we will detail momentarily when we describe each pillar. The U.S. Executive Order 13595 required agencies to follow the WPS NAP and outlines agency responsibilities and reporting requirements. The 2013 DoD WPS Implementation Guide currently governs the DoD's WPS efforts. The revised 2016 NAP on WPS included additional actions and outcomes directed to the DoD. For simplicity, we will include an overview of these. The DoD has dedicated specific staff to address gender considerations in keeping with the DoD's mission. Within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy coordinates the development and implementation of DoD's efforts on women, peace, and security. The Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness coordinates efforts on sexual assault prevention and response, in addition to combating trafficking in persons. The Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness also provides policy guidance and oversight of the military departments on policies related to the recruitment, retention, treatment, and integration of women into U.S. Armed Forces. Foremost among the DoD's accomplishments is the integration of WPS objectives into key policy, strategy, and planning documents, to include, for example, the National Security Strategy. We will talk about this shortly. In the DoD Implementation Guide of the 2013 NAP, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs stated the mission of the WPS to be as simple as it is profound: to empower half the world's population as equal partners in preventing conflict and building peace in countries threatened and affected by war, violence, and insecurity. He continued that achieving this goal was critical to our national and global security. When we undercut the contributions of one gender, we do so at our own peril, denying ourselves half the talent, half the resources, half the potential of the population. The 2016 version of the NAP identified the initial goal of the WPS to be critical to national security and strongly supported the following objectives: integrating a gender-sensitive approach into the U.S. government work in conflict-affected environments to address the different needs of men and women, increasing women's participation in peace processes, protecting women and children from violence, promoting women's roles in conflict prevention, and ensuring women and children have access to relief recovery. Considering the gender perspective is a crucial cross-cutting factor that potentially impacts every aspect of an operation. The incorporation of a gender perspective was found to be valuable in past operations through means such as countering violent extremism and promoting peacebuilding in Burma following the election of a record number of women into policy-making positions. It is vital for land component forces to integrate gender perspectives into their mission training, plans, and execution at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels. The exclusion of any human security perspective, including a gender perspective, can enable gaps in mission planning and disconnects in operational effectiveness to develop. Such gaps may challenge the ability to consolidate gains and further hinder mission success, potentially hindering the U.S. from winning in a complex environment. The National Security Strategy of 2017 is one of 2 strategic documents that incorporate a gender perspective. One section in the NSS is titled Empower Women and Youth and states, societies that empower women to participate fully in civic and economic life are more prosperous and peaceful. We will support efforts to advance women's equality, protect the rights of women and girls, and promote women and youth empowerment programs. While the NSS identified the need to integrate a gender perspective, the 2015 National Military Strategy, or NMS, alluded to the importance of gender mainstreaming within its own force. In the long term, this may provide talented human resources on the ground to support such policies as WPS, where women, along with their male counterparts, can provide a more diverse and enhanced perspective. The NMS spoke to adapting an organized culture and addressed that critical to building the best military possible are efforts to further integrate women across the force by providing them greater opportunities for service. Now let's touch on some more history. As of January 2018, 74 NAPs on WPS have been adopted, and some are also second or third generation. Here it's important to note how the 2016 U.S. NAP objectives on WPS each connected to the WPS agenda and various UNSCR pillars. The 4 pillars are protection for women during and after conflict, participation in all levels of decision-making around peace and conflict, prevention of violence against women and violence more broadly, and equal access to relief recovery. Let's cross-reference these with the 5 NAP objectives. The first U.S.-specific objective was institutionalization, and referred to national integration as a means of normalizing WPS within the interagency. The second objective in the WPS National Action Plan was women as equal participants in conflict resolution mediation. This objective states that evidence shows peace arrangements are more likely to be secured and are more likely to endure when women are meaningfully involved, and indicates that the DoD has dedicated staff members to addressing gender considerations with this in mind. According to the UN, when women directly participate in negotiations, there's a 20% increase in the probability of an agreement lasting at least 2 years, and a 35% increase in the probability of an agreement lasting at least 15 years. There are many examples in which peace negotiations fail where women are excluded from the table. An example of this is in Colombia in 2016, when a peace treaty was signed to bring an end to a 50-year conflict between the government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces. Women made up 20% of the government team and 43% of the FARC negotiating team, marking this conflict as the first time a gender subcommission has been included in a peace negotiation. As part of this positive impact made by women, the final treaty included a range of provisions specific to women, including the promotion of women's socio-political and economic rights, along with measures against gender-based violence. The third objective in the NAP was protections for women during and after conflict. As per the title, this objective aims to protect women from violence during all parts of a conflict, including post-conflict. Violence against women, particularly in the form of sexual violence, is increasingly recognized as a facet of many conflicts today, from the Balkans to Africa to the Middle East. It is important to note that people in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex or LGBTI community are also vulnerable in conflict and made a target due to homophobia and transphobia. The fourth objective of the National Action Plan was women in conflict prevention efforts. Women frequently hold critical knowledge about escalating conflict, including increasing risk of violent extremism. For example, women in Sierra Leone knew of plans to attack UN peacekeepers, but threats for their personal safety prevented them from relaying information. These women were overlooked or unable to report due to safety concerns. With this in mind, the NAP was committed to strengthening efforts to monitor the status of women and ensure that conflict early warning indication incorporates a full gender analysis. The fifth and final National Action Plan objective was women's equal access to the means for recovery. This regards women's access to relief and recovery as critical to protect. This objective in practice may include women's participation in camp management committees to ensure that displacement camps are safer and assistance programs are more accessible for vulnerable populations. These vulnerable populations addressed again would not only include women and girls, but also members of the LGBTI community. Remember, men and boys are also part of this, as well as the interrelation between each gender. Now let's just highlight some of the actions and their corresponding outcomes identified for the Department of Defense in the NAP on WPS in 2016. The actions covered incorporating the National Action Plan objectives into guidance and planning documents. However, the new WPS strategy will now direct the way forward. Additional actions in the 2016 NAP for the Department of Defense involved areas around data collection mechanisms, participation of female U.S. military personnel, partner nation women's participation, incorporating modules in supporting education and awareness initiatives, accountability and transnational justice mechanisms, zero tolerance of human trafficking, women in disaster and emergency preparedness, women's participation in efforts to de-radicalize men and women, equal access to aid distribution, and team expertise in gender and protection. This concludes our overview of the actions and outcomes directed for the DoD implementation within the 2016 NAP on WPS. It is important to understand how these actions and outcomes were applied, and it gives us context in how we have historically thought about these concepts. Moving forward and within the joint environment, given a multi-domain battle, we look to further integrate WPS concepts and gender perspective to maximize mission success. An example of this is as follows. Air targeting strategic planning activities considers if women and girls are being coerced to act as human shields to protect the enemy to deter attack, but also to spread a perception that the intervening force is killing local wives and daughters. Maritime piracy activities consider if girls are being trafficked and boys are being forced into labor to support illegal operations, but also if young, unemployed men are being recruited into piracy for a promise of being sold a wife. Coastal rescue activities consider if the primary population of displaced women and girls are vulnerable to enemy exploitation and how enabling participation from this vulnerable population may act as a force multiplier during operations. Cyber communication activities consider if women have access to cell phones for early warning notification, but also which genders have control or access to communications. In the examples above, having situational awareness can be significant of understanding how the intricacies of these activities, as well as those within the interagency such as USAID or the Department of Homeland Security, can weave in and out between domains and ultimately have an accumulative impact on the land component combatant operations. Now let's take a look at the most recent U.S. efforts in WPS. To highlight the U.S.'s commitment to the WPS agenda, the landmark Women, Peace, and Security Act was signed into law on October 6, 2017. This act made the U.S. the first country to pass comprehensive WPS legislation within the international community. The act also reiterated that women remain underrepresented in conflict prevention, resolution, and post-conflict peacebuilding efforts. It also impressed that women in conflict-affected regions have achieved significant success in moderating violent extremism, countering terrorism, resolving disputes, and stabilizing societies. Last, it reminded that peace negotiations are more likely to succeed and result in durable agreements when women are involved. This act aims to ensure that the U.S. promotes the meaningful participation of women in mediation and negotiation processes seeking to prevent, mitigate, or resolve violent conflict. Stated in the act itself, specific requirements are laid out for the DoD that address how the Secretary of Defense shall ensure the relevant personnel receive training as appropriate in the following areas. The first is to train in conflict prevention, peace processes, mitigation, resolution, and security initiatives that specifically address the importance of meaningful participation by women. The second is to include gender considerations and the meaningful participation by women in training regarding international human rights law and international humanitarian law, as relevant, and the protection of civilians from violence, exploitation, and trafficking in persons. The third is to have effective strategies and best practices for ensuring meaningful participation by women. The 2017 WPS Act directed that a WPS strategy be issued for which the DoD would establish an implementation plan and directives. As we continue to transition WPS within our force and as prescribed under the WPS strategy and DoD WPS executive policies, we look to apply the WPS concepts and integrate a gender perspective in all operations and within the planning process in the U.S. Army. Future topics that will be covered in more depth in Part 2 of this video series will prescribe the operations process as informed through the WPS strategy and subsequent DoD policies. Let's briefly discuss what Part 2 will include. We will look at the importance of identifying early warning indicators of conflict and instability related to gender. We will use the planning analysis tool known as PMISI-PT, which is the acronym for Political, Military, Economic, Social, Information, Infrastructure, Physical, and Time. We will compare how women, men, boys, and girls experience conflict differently within this and other tools. This also indicates how each gender has a unique role in conflict resolution. We will walk through the operations planning process starting with mission analysis and ending with orders, production while applying a gender perspective. Now let's do a review and summarize what we just covered in Part 1 of this video. We started off giving a brief explanation of what WPS is and how WPS aims to empower half the world's population as equal partners to preventing conflict and building peace, while endeavoring to rectify the disproportionate adverse impacts of armed conflict on women, and that this ultimately benefits all genders. We then discussed the UNSCR 1325 and how countries around the world created national action plans. The U.S. NAP was established by Executive Order 13595 with an accompanying Department of Defense implementation guide. The NAP was revised in 2016. We went over the 4 pillars of the WPS agenda and compared these to the 5 objectives in the NAP. We explained how the NAP strived to institutionalize a gender-sensitive approach to defense, diplomatic, and development activities by supporting participation of women in decision-making processes, protection from violence activities, conflict prevention initiatives, and equal access to relief and recovery assistance programs. We then highlighted each action complementing outcomes identified for the DoD and the NAP on WPS. We completed the historical crosswalk by discussing the most recent law passed in the U.S. called the WPS Act and anticipated WPS strategy and the complementing DoD implementation plan and directives. We concluded with a brief overview of what Part 2 of this video series will speak to, including early warning indication, the acronym PMISI-PT, and the operations process. As we lean forward in implementing WPS across the U.S. Army, we appreciate the importance of integrating a gender perspective to better understand how each gender experiences conflict differently and how each can have an equal role in being part of the solution. We also realize that WPS is about the inclusive role that women in particular can play as key stakeholders in peace processes. WPS speaks to national security interests related to gender inclusivity and ultimately support the provision of justice through strong institutions to uphold these values. This concludes Part 1 of this video on WPS, an introduction to women, peace, and security, and DoD's implementation. For additional information, you may contact the Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute. Also, you may want to inquire about the Joint Certified Operational Gender Advisor course. In addition, Joint Knowledge Online, JKO, currently has 2 training modules called Improving Operational Effectiveness by Integrating Gender Perspectives and Role of the Gender Advisors. PKSOI's Stability Operations Lessons Learned and Information Management System also published a sampler edition in November of 2017 called Operationalizing WPS. Last, Joint and Army publications are beginning to populate WPS narratives, including the Joint Publication 307 on Stability, Joint Publication 307.3 on Peace Ops, and the ATP 307.6 on the protection of civilians.